November 1887. Montana Territory, Bitterroot Valley. Nobody paid any mind to the dark opening carved into the eastern slope of the ridge. From the frozen wagon trail below, it looked completely abandoned, nothing more than a black wound in the hillside, with a thin, barely visible wisp of smoke drifting against a leaden winter sky. Travelers passing through the snowbound valley dismissed it without a second glance. To them, it was just another failed claim, another broken dream, left behind by a man who had given up and moved on to softer country. But inside that earth-covered shelter, an entirely different reality was unfolding. While every traditional timber cabin in the valley was burning through cords of precious firewood at an alarming rate, while families huddled together against drafty log walls that constantly leaked warmth into the merciless cold, that dugout held a quiet secret. It was a principle of physics so simple that generations of experienced frontier builders had walked right past it. It was a design so contrary to everything standard construction demanded that even bringing it up invited open mockery from seasoned pioneers. What did one quiet homesteader understand about heat, earth, and physical survival that an entire community of frontiersmen had missed? This is the story of how Isaac Brenner built a shelter that defied common sense and outlasted every conventional cabin when the coldest winter in recorded Montana history descended upon the territory. There was no fame in what he did, no grand recognition, just 32 consecutive days of sustained, draft-free warmth, while his neighbors' homes turned into literal iceboxes with fireplaces. If you value frontier survival engineering that actually worked when human lives were on the line, real practical physics rather than untested theory, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from today. Let us build a community of people who understand that old methods are not obsolete methods. Now, picture this. Let me show you what Isaac understood that everyone else ignored. The year was 1887, but to understand why Isaac Brenner did what he did, you have to go back 2 years earlier to the spring of 1885. Isaac was a 34-year-old carpenter from Pennsylvania. By all outward appearances, he was unremarkable in every way that seemed to matter on the western frontier. He possessed a medium build, steady hands, a patient demeanor, and a young family dependent on his labor. His wife, Catherine, and their 2 small daughters, Emily, who was 6, and Ruth, who was 4. They had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley with the exact same high hopes as every other homesteading family of that era. They sought fertile land, abundant timber, clean river water, and the opportunity to carve something permanent out of the wilderness. Their very first winter in the valley taught them what permanent really meant in the high country. The cabin Isaac constructed during his first summer followed every standard rule he had been taught back east. It was 16 feet wide by 20 feet long, constructed from hand-hewn pine logs. The gaps between the logs were meticulously chinked with native moss and heavy river clay. He built a solid stone fireplace on the north wall to block the prevailing wind, topped the structure with a hand-split shake roof, and installed a raised wooden plank floor designed to keep ground moisture away from their living space. On the outside, it looked like every other respectable cabin scattered across the valley basin. On the inside, it performed like every other cabin, too, which meant it was cold. Not merely uncomfortable cold, but dangerous, unrelenting, bone-chilling cold. The stone fireplace was a ravenous monster that demanded constant feeding day and night. During the bitterest hours after midnight, when the hearth fire inevitably died down to low embers, the interior temperature of the cabin would plunge by 30 degrees in a matter of hours. By early morning, thick sheets of ice formed across the top of the water bucket, sitting just a few feet from the hearth. Catherine was forced to keep the 2 small girls bundled in heavy wool coats even while sitting indoors next to the firebox. Emily developed a deep, wet cough that refused to clear up for weeks, the kind of ominous, rattling cough that claimed the lives of frontier children in their sleep before spring ever arrived. Isaac burned through his entire winter wood pile by the middle of February. He spent the agonizingly cold weeks of March out in the frozen forest, cutting green timber with a crosscut saw, hauling heavy logs back on a hand, sled through thigh-deep snow, only to watch those green logs hiss, smoke, and struggle to produce heat in the hearth. The wood was too wet, too green, and too frozen to burn clean or yield efficient BTUs. When April finally arrived and the valley began its slow thaw, Emily's cough gradually faded away. The Brenner family had survived their first mountain winter, but Isaac spent those 4 frozen months doing relentless math in his head. Here is the cold, hard truth. The numbers did not lie. Isaac had burned 6 full cords of dense timber over the course of 5 months, just to keep his young family barely above freezing. That represented nearly 2 full months of grueling, back-breaking physical labor devoted entirely to harvesting heating fuel. It was unsustainable. It was exhausting. Worst of all, as Isaac analyzed the mechanics of his cabin, he realized it was completely unnecessary. During those long, sleepless winter nights spent sitting by the hearth to feed the flames, Isaac had noticed something crucial about the construction materials around him. It was the massive stone fireplace itself. That 4,000-pound structure, built from thick slabs of local sandstone, held heat for hours after the actual fire had died down to ash. Long after the flames vanished, you could press your bare palm against those heavy stones and feel a steady, gentle warmth radiating back into the room. It was not a scorching heat, but a persistent, reliable thermal energy that bled into the cold air slowly and continuously. Isaac did not call it thermal mass, but he understood the physical reality of it intuitively. If 4,000 pounds of riverstone could hold and radiate heat so effectively, what about the hundreds of tons of living earth surrounding them on the mountain slopes? By June of 1887, Isaac made a deliberate choice that would make him the subject of endless gossip and laughter across the valley. He decided that his next home would not stand on top of the ground exposed to the winds. He was going to build his home directly into the living earth. Isaac selected a specific location, 300 yards up the slope from his existing timber cabin. It was a south-facing hillside, featuring natural drainage, rocky but stable soil, and an unobstructed view of the valley basin below. He picked up his pickaxe and shovel and began digging in July. He was not digging a simple root cellar to store potatoes, nor was he excavating a temporary shelter to hold them over for a season. He was carving out a permanent homestead home directly into the hillside. The layout was specific, highly deliberate, and completely contrary to every established principle of proper frontier building. Isaac excavated 12 feet deep into the rising slope of the hill, creating a rectangular living space 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The back wall and both side walls were left as raw earth, cut clean and vertical directly into the dense subsoil. The front south-facing wall, the only surface exposed to the outdoor elements, would be constructed from heavy timber posts and field stone, featuring a single sturdy door and one modest glass window positioned to capture the low winter sun. The roof construction was the most critical piece of Isaac's plan. He built a heavy structural frame using peeled, thick logs capable of supporting immense weight. Over these timber rafters, he laid split shakes, followed by a heavy layer of canvas, thoroughly soaked in boiled pine tar, to create an impenetrable waterproof membrane. Above the sealed canvas, Isaac shoveled 12 full inches of dense sod, complete with living grass and intact root structures, packing the soil tightly across the entire roof structure. The weight pressing down on those log rafters was enormous, measuring thousands of pounds per square yard. But the insulation value provided by a foot of packed dirt and living turf was astronomically higher than anything a double-layered wood-shake roof could ever offer. Inside the dugout, Isaac did not stop at the earthen walls. He excavated the floor down an additional 18 inches below the entry threshold and laid a dense foundation using flat river stones collected from the creek bed below. He set the stones tightly together over a bed of coarse sand, creating a thick, solid stone floor beneath their feet. Instead of plastering or planking over the earthen walls, he left the compacted soil exposed, but carved narrow, angled ventilation channels near the ceiling level. These channels angled upward and outward through the turf roof, allowing stagnant air and moisture to vent naturally while preventing draft intrusion. For the hearth, Isaac built a sandstone fireplace directly into the center of the front timber wall. He designed it with a much smaller firebox than his old cabin possessed, but coupled it with a taller, narrower chimney stack. Every single stone was selected for its density and ability to absorb and store heat. The physics driving Isaac's design were fundamental. Ground temperature 6 feet below the surface remains remarkably stable throughout the entire year, hovering between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether the air above is scorching in July or frozen in January. By surrounding 3 sides and the roof of his home with that vast, temperature-stable mass of soil, Isaac was no longer fighting the outdoor weather. He was leveraging the natural thermal storage of the earth itself. When you add internal thermal mass, such as a thick stone floor and a stone hearth, you create a natural thermal battery. The heat generated by a small wood fire charges the surrounding stone and earth. Once the fire goes out, that stored energy slowly discharges back into the living space over many hours. By eliminating wind exposure on 3 sides, drafty log joints are eliminated, stopping convective heat loss in its tracks. It was not complicated magic. It was pure physics. But it was different enough from standard frontier practice that his neighbors noticed immediately, and it did not take long for the laughter to begin. The very first neighbor to voice his opinion was Samuel Hodge, a prominent timber merchant who sold milled lumber to homesteaders throughout Flathead County and the Bitterroot Valley. Samuel rode past Isaac's property in early August, on his way to inspect a timber cut. When he saw Isaac hauling heavy river stones up the hillside and shoveling mounds of dirt onto a low roof frame, he reined his horse to a complete stop. Samuel looked at the excavation, shook his head, and called out, "That is not a proper home, Brenner. That is nothing more than a hole in the dirt." Isaac paused his work, rested his hands on his shovel, and looked down at the merchant. "It is a shelter, Samuel." "A shelter for what?" Samuel chuckled. "A family of badgers?" Samuel shook his head, let out a loud laugh, and rode away down the trail. By that evening, the story of Isaac Brenner's foolishness had circulated through the local trading post. By the following morning, half the homesteaders in the valley knew that the carpenter from Pennsylvania was digging his family into a dirt burrow like an animal. The comments came steady and relentless throughout late summer. Homesteaders stopping by to trade tools or buy supplies could not resist dropping casual remarks. They asked Isaac if he planned to farm mushrooms in the dark, or if Catherine knew she was going to be living underground like a cave dweller. In early September, an experienced homesteader named Vernon Cale stopped his wagon near the slope to watch Isaac work. Vernon had lived in the valley since 1878. He was a practical, respected man whose opinions on frontier survival carried real weight among the settlers. Vernon walked up the slope, stood at the open entrance of the dugout for a full minute, with his arms crossed over his chest, and carefully inspected the timber, framing, and sod roof. Vernon turned to Isaac and said, "You are wasting good structural timber on that roof, Isaac." Isaac set down his mallet and looked at his neighbor. "How so, Vernon?" "Because you are going to tear the whole thing down within a year," Vernon replied flatly. "A man cannot live in a dirt hole with his family. There is no natural light, no proper circulation, and it will stay as damp as a root cellar. Your wife will come to hate it, and your little girls are going to fall sick from the damp cold." Isaac wiped his brow and looked at the heavy sod roof. "I appreciate the concern, Vernon, but the math tells a different story." Vernon shrugged his shoulders, turned toward his wagon, and said, "It is your time and your lumber, Brenner." Nobody tried to physically stop Isaac from completing his project, but they completely stopped taking him seriously as a builder. When Isaac visited the general store for iron nails or chimney mortar, conversation among the men gathered around the potbelly stove would drift off into polite, quiet nods. He was treated with the distant courtesy reserved for someone who had made a foolish choice and would soon have to pay for it when winter arrived. By late October of 1887, the dugout was fully completed. Isaac moved Catherine, Emily, and Ruth out of their old drafty log cabin and into the earth shelter before the first light snow flurries dusted the valley floor. Catherine did not complain about the new arrangement. The children treated the earth-sheltered home like an exciting secret fortress built into the side of the mountain. 4-year-old Ruth ran her small hands along the smooth, dry earth walls, laughing at how cool and quiet the room felt compared to their old wooden cabin where the wind constantly whistled through the chinking. Isaac lit the very first fire, in the central sandstone hearth on October 18, 1887. The draft pulled cleanly up the chimney, drawing air smoothly through the structure while warming the stone floor beneath their feet. And then, less than a month later, winter arrived. It was not the typical winter the settlers had prepared for. It was the winter that would forever rewrite every assumption the pioneers held about survival in the high country. On November 14, 1887, the Arctic front hit the Bitterroot Valley. At dawn, the outdoor thermometer at the trading post read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, the temperature had plummeted to 9 degrees and was dropping fast. By sunset, the mercury plunged to -4 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by screaming wind gusts reaching 40 miles per hour across the valley floor. It was not a standard mountain blizzard. It was a massive atmospheric cold surge, a dense polar high-pressure system that locked itself directly over the northern Rocky Mountains and refused to nudge. The cold was not just sharp. It was crushing. It was the kind of absolute cold that made a person's lungs ache with every deep breath. It froze the natural sap deep inside standing pine trees, causing thick trunks to burst open with sudden, explosive cracks that echoed through the snowbound forests like rifle fire. By November 16th, the outdoor temperature dropped to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. By November 19th, the thermometer registered -31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air came to a dead, frozen standstill. The valley had experienced brief cold snaps in years past, but never a sustained Arctic siege like this. Days bled into weeks with zero relief, zero sunshine warming the air, and zero thaw. The sky remained a clear, pale, merciless blue, while the ground freeze penetrated deeper into the soil with every passing night. Across the valley, families living in standard timber cabins found themselves trapped in a desperate struggle to maintain heat. Their fires consumed firewood at twice the normal rate. Wood piles that were calculated to last through March were being decimated in weeks. In traditional cabins, the intense cold created severe structural drafts. The extreme temperature difference between the roasting hearth and the frozen exterior walls caused hot air to rise rapidly toward the roof timber gaps, pulling freezing air inward through every microfissure in the log chinking. Chimneys that usually drafted cleanly began backfilling room interiors with wood smoke because the air column inside the flue cooled down too quickly to maintain a strong upward draft. Settlers woke up in the mornings to discover thick white frost coating the interior log walls right beside their beds. Buckets of drinking water froze solid on tables located just 10 feet from burning fireplaces. Samuel Hodge and his sons were forced to burn through 8 full cords of prime timber in less than 3 weeks just to prevent frostbite. The wood he had harvested to sell at a profit was being consumed entirely to keep his own home habitability above freezing. At Vernon Cale's cabin, the massive central stone chimney cracked straight down its mortar line due to severe thermal shock, spilling blinding smoke into the living quarters until Vernon was forced to scramble onto his frozen roof to seal the fissure with wet river mud and heavy canvas. Another homesteading family living 2 miles down the valley was forced to abandon their timber cabin completely. They packed what blankets and food they could carry on a hand sled and trudged through deep snow into town, paying to sleep on the floor of the local hotel because it possessed a massive iron stove in the lobby. Social visits across the valley ceased entirely. Nobody traveled unless it was a matter of life or death. The energy required to move through -30-degree air, coupled with the extreme exposure to frostbite, made travel impossible. The Bitterroot Valley contracted into isolated, struggling points of light, with every family burning through their reserves, shivering in dark rooms, and praying for an early thaw. And then, on December 3rd, 20 days into the continuous freeze, someone noticed something strange on the mountain slope. Samuel Hodge was riding his workhorse along the ridge trail to inspect a line of livestock fences. He had deliberately avoided looking toward Isaac Brenner's slope for weeks, feeling embarrassed by his earlier jokes and assuming the Brenner family had long since abandoned the hillside hole to move back into their old cabin or flee to the town hotel. As Samuel rounded the timber bend overlooking the eastern slope, he stopped his horse and stared up the hill. Rising from the sod roof of the dugout was a single, slender thread of wood smoke drifting steadily into the frozen sky. It was not a thick, desperate cloud of dark smoke produced by a roaring timber fire, but a thin, efficient plume. Samuel blinked in disbelief. His own home was currently burning 3 separate fires simultaneously, one in the main hearth, one in the iron cookstove, and another in a makeshift metal brazier set in the corner, and his family was still shivering inside their wool coats. Curiosity overriding his pride, Samuel turned his horse off the main trail and guided the animal up the snow-covered slope toward the dugout. As he neared the heavy timber doorway carved into the earth, he felt something impossible before he even dismounted. It was warmth. A gentle, steady radiation of warmth was leaking from the small gaps around the insulated doorframe. It was not the scorched, dry air of a roaring furnace, but a calm, stable, present warmth. Before Samuel could knock, the heavy timber door swung open, and Isaac Brenner stepped out onto the threshold. Samuel stared at the carpenter in absolute shock. Isaac was standing in the sub-zero air, wearing nothing more than a wool vest over a cotton shirt, with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Samuel sat frozen in his saddle, his face wrapped in a heavy wool scarf, icicles hanging from his mustache. He looked at Isaac, looked at the quiet chimney above the sod roof, and rasped, "How is this possible, Isaac?" Isaac looked up at his neighbor, smiled faintly, and gestured toward the open doorway. "Earth holds heat, Samuel," Isaac said softly. "Stone holds heat. The fire in my hearth went out 6 hours ago." Samuel stared at him, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. "That is impossible, Brenner." Isaac stepped aside and gestured into the dimly lit room. "Come inside, Samuel. See the numbers for yourself. Stay with me here," because what Samuel Hodge saw when he stepped across that threshold completely shattered every rule of traditional frontier construction. The interior temperature of the dugout was sitting at a stable, comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the air was hovering at minus 28 degrees, with a wind chill driving the effective temperature even lower. That was a 90-degree temperature differential between the inside of Isaac's home and the frozen mountain outside, maintained effortlessly while the hearth fire had been dead out for over 6 hours. Samuel pulled off his thick leather mittens with trembling hands, letting his fingers adjust to the calm air. The room was not blindingly bright. It was illuminated by a single small glass window facing south and a low oil lamp on the dining table, but it was remarkably dry, comfortable, and warm. Catherine Brenner was sitting at the wooden table, calmly mending a shirt. Little Emily and Ruth were playing barefoot on the stone floor with wooden building blocks, their cheeks flushed with healthy color rather than the pale gray of constant cold. Samuel looked around the room, his eyes wide, and asked in a quiet, reverent tone, "How much wood have you burned since the cold front hit?" Isaac pointed to a small, neat stack of split hardwood resting in the corner near the hearth. "About half a cord every 2 weeks," Isaac replied calmly. "Sometimes a bit less." Samuel did the calculations in his head, and the math hit him like a physical blow. His own family was burning through a full cord of timber every 4 days just to keep their cabin living room at 40 degrees. Isaac's total wood consumption was 1/8 of what a traditional timber cabin required. 1/8? That cannot be right, Samuel stammered. You cannot get that kind of heat from a small fire. It is not about making a massive fire, Isaac explained, walking over to the central sandstone hearth. It is about retaining the energy you create. I burn 2 small loads of wood a day, one in the morning and one in the evening. The fire heats these river stones under our feet and the heavy sandstone walls of the hearth. The living earth behind those walls stops the cold from ever penetrating the room. Overnight, the room temperature drops maybe 8 degrees at most, Isaac continued. By dawn, when I wake up, the thermometer on the wall still reads 54 or 55 degrees. I toss a few dry sticks on the surviving coals, open the draft, and we are back to 62 degrees within an hour. Samuel walked slowly to the back wall of the room and pressed his bare hand directly against the exposed earth. The soil was cool to the touch, but it was not cold. It was certainly not frozen, and it was not pulling thermal energy out of the room the way a thin pine log wall did during an Arctic freeze. "The earth does not steal your heat," Isaac said, watching his neighbor inspect the wall. "It buffers it. It keeps the core baseline stable. In the heat of July, this dirt will keep my family cool. In the freeze of November, it keeps us from freezing to death. The stone floor and the hearth are heat batteries, Samuel. You charge them up when you burn wood, and they release that charge slowly for 12 hours after the fire dies down." Samuel turned his gaze upward, studying the heavy log rafters, the sealed turf ceiling, and the carefully angled ventilation channels that kept the air fresh without creating a cold draft. Every single element of the dugout was intentional. Every detail had been engineered with a clear physical purpose. Samuel remembered Vernon Cale's confident prediction from 2 months earlier that Isaac would tear the dirt hole down within a year. Isaac smiled faintly, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "Vernon is welcome to come up the hill whenever he likes. The door is always open." Samuel left 20 minutes later, riding back down the mountain slope in silence. But the hard physical numbers stayed with him every foot of the way. 62 degrees indoors, half a quart of wood every 2 weeks. A family living in total comfort, while the rest of the Bitterroot Valley was burning through its winter survival reserves. Samuel told his wife the story that evening over a cold dinner. She told her sister the following morning. By December 10th, 3 separate homesteading families had ridden up the mountain slope to inspect the dugout for themselves. By December 15th, Vernon Cale made the trip up the hill. The veteran builder stood in the open doorway of Isaac's earth shelter for a long, silent moment. He took in the surrounding warmth, the completely dry air, and the 2 young girls playing on the stone floor in lightweight cotton dresses. Vernon looked at Isaac, held out his hand, and said quietly, "I was wrong, Brenner." Isaac shook his hand warmly. "I appreciate you saying so, Vernon." "How deep into the slope did you dig?" Vernon asked, pulling out a small notebook and a pencil. 12 feet vertical into the hillside," Isaac replied, walking his neighbor through the construction details. 18 inches down for the stone floor bed. Vernon walked over to the hearth, crouched down on his knees, and carefully examined the stone firebox and flue alignment. "It is smaller than a standard fireplace," he observed. "You do not need a massive firebox when you are not losing your heat to the wind," Isaac explained. "Traditional cabins rely on brute force, burning huge piles of wood to fight continuous convective heat loss. This design relies on thermal conservation." Vernon stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked around the room one last time. "Do you mind if I bring a few other men up here to see this, Isaac? Families are hurting down in the basin. Wood supplies are running dangerously low. If this method works, and it clearly does, they need to understand how to build it. Bring whoever wants to learn," Isaac said. Over the next 10 days, 14 different homesteading families visited Isaac Brenner's dugout. Some stayed for 5 minutes, standing near the warm hearth in quiet awe. Others stayed for hours, taking careful measurements of the sod roof timbering, sketching the fireplace dimensions, and asking detailed questions about soil moisture and wall ventilation. Every single visitor left the dugout with the exact same look on their face, a combination of quiet disbelief and a sharp, stinging sense of regret. They realized they had mocked a brilliant physical solution simply because it did not look like their traditional idea of what a proper home should be. The outdoor temperature across the Bitterroot Valley did not rise above -18 degrees Fahrenheit for 32 consecutive days, lasting from November 14th until December 16th, 1887. It was the longest, most severe sustained freeze in the recorded history of the Montana Territory. While neighboring families burned through their entire winter reserves of timber in less than a month and spent the remainder of the freeze shivering in damp, drafty log cabins, Isaac Brenner's family remained completely comfortable, burning a fraction of the fuel. The dugout had not merely survived the worst winter on record, it had triumphed. The numbers were undeniable, measurable, and impossible for anyone in the territory to ignore. The thaw finally arrived in late December. By December 20th, the outdoor temperature climbed to 12 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. A weather shift that felt almost tropical after 5 weeks of sub-zero Arctic cold. Smoke rose thick and heavy from every cabin chimney in the valley as families began the long, hard process of restocking their depleted woodpiles, repairing cracked masonry, and assessing the damage winter had inflicted on their homesteads. Isaac's earth shelter design was no longer treated as a strange curiosity. It became the central topic of serious construction technical discussion across the territory. Homesteaders gathered at the trading post to discuss excavation depths, sod roof angles, thermal stone selection, and methods for retrofitting existing timber cabins with earth-sheltered additions. Samuel Hodge was the very first settler to commit to the new design. In early January of 1888, while the ground was still partially frozen, Samuel staked out a south-facing slope a mile from his original home and began clearing timber for an earth-sheltered dugout. He hired 2 laborers to assist with the heavy digging, using Isaac's structural dimensions as his exact template. By March, Samuel's family moved into a 16 by 18-foot earth shelter, featuring a thick sod roof and a sandstone hearth. Vernon Cale took a hybrid approach. Rather than abandoning his traditional log cabin, Vernon excavated deep into the earth slope directly behind his existing house. He constructed an earth-sheltered rear wing connected to his main living room, using the original log cabin as a front windbreak and the living hillside as thick thermal insulation. The hybrid design was exceptionally practical and cut his winter fuel consumption by 60% the following year. By the autumn of 1888, 5 new earth-sheltered homes were under construction across the valley. By 1890, 11 homesteading families within a 15-mile radius of the trading post lived in some variation of an earth-sheltered structure. They called them hillside dugouts, earth lodges, or Brenner-style shelters. Though Isaac Brenner never claimed credit, patented his ideas, or sought recognition, his practical engineering spread naturally from neighbor to neighbor across the western frontier. It was not a flashy revolution. It was a practical evolution in human survival. Isaac Brenner's original dugout on that Montana hillside stood intact for 43 years. The Brenner family lived in the earth shelter until 1902, when Isaac eventually constructed a larger 2-story frame house lower down the slope for his grown children. Even then, the family kept the original dugout meticulously maintained as a cold storage root cellar and storm shelter. The raw dirt walls of the dugout never collapsed. The heavy sod roof, relayered with fresh turf every few years, never leaked a single drop of water. The central sandstone hearth never cracked. By 1930, long after the original homestead had passed to new owners, the structure was finally abandoned. By 1950, the main entrance timber lintel decayed, allowing the surrounding hillside to gently collapse inward, reclaiming the space the earth had lent to a clever carpenter 63 years earlier. Today, if you walk those mountain slopes in Flathead County with a trained eye, you can still find a subtle rectangular depression in the earth, flanked by a few moss-covered river stones, the faint outline of a home where one family thrived while an entire valley froze. There is a profound lesson buried in that Montana hillside that goes far deeper than thermal battery calculations or sod roof insulation values. Isaac Brenner did not invent earth-sheltered construction. Indigenous peoples across the Great Plains had constructed earth lodges for centuries, structures partially submerged in the ground, engineered to handle extreme atmospheric shifts with minimal fuel requirements. The core principle of leveraging the earth for thermal stability was ancient, but it had been systematically dismissed by 19th-century pioneers because an earth dugout did not look like progress. It did not fit their vision of frontier success. It looked primitive, backward, and unrefined compared to a hand-hewn log cabin. And so, people froze inside their proper timber homes, while a physical solution older than the nation itself sat right beneath their feet, waiting for someone humble enough to realize that old does not mean obsolete. Isaac understood what the rest of the valley had forgotten. The natural world is not an enemy to be conquered with brute force, but a system of physical laws to be understood and utilized. 6 feet beneath the surface, ground temperatures remain stable. 12 inches of packed soil and living sod provide superior insulation compared to thick pine logs. Dense fieldstone holds thermal energy far longer than open air. These are not opinions or theories. They are the immutable laws of thermodynamics. They work whether you believe in them or not. The winter of 1887 did not make Isaac's engineering work. It simply revealed what had been true all along. Modern sustainable architecture is rediscovering these exact same principles today, under new technical names: passive solar design, thermal mass storage, earth berming, and geothermal exchange. We have refined the building materials, added digital climate sensors, and automated the ventilation systems, but the core physics remain identical to the dugout Isaac Brenner hand-dug in 1887. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from today, and describe the coldest winter weather you have ever personally experienced. Did you have to find creative DIY ways to keep your home warm when the power failed? What forgotten historical building technique do you think deserves a serious second look today? If you found real value in this historical deep dive, if you learned something practical that might actually matter when the modern grid fails or the supply chains break, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Every single week, I bring you one documented survival technique from history that actually worked when human lives depended on it. No fluff, no armchair theories, just proven physical engineering that stood the test of the hardest conditions our ancestors ever faced. Educational note: this presentation contains dramatized narrative reconstructions based on historical earth-sheltered construction methodologies documented in the Montana Territory during the late 19th century. While narrative elements and dialogue are rendered for storytelling purposes, the technical principles of thermal mass, soil temperature baselines, and convective heat loss reflect verified thermodynamic principles. Modern earth-sheltered construction should always comply with local building codes, structural engineering standards, and professional safety consultations. To truly understand why Isaac Brenner's dugout succeeded, while conventional timber cabins across the Bitterroot Valley failed, you have to break down the hidden thermodynamics of frontier shelter. Here is what everyone missed. Standard log cabin construction is inherently flawed when subjected to sustained Arctic conditions. Think about that for a second. A traditional log cabin built in 1887 was considered the absolute pinnacle of frontier architecture. Homesteaders cut heavy pine or fir logs, notched the corners, stacked them 8 or 10 feet high, and filled the horizontal gaps between the timber courses with chinking a crude mixture of straw, mud, river sand, and dry moss. On paper, a solid pine log 4 or 5 inches thick seems like a substantial barrier against the cold, but in reality, wood is a relatively poor thermal storage medium. While solid wood has a modest insulation value, log walls suffer from 2 fatal vulnerabilities during an Arctic freeze: thermal bridging and air infiltration. As outdoor temperatures plunge well below zero, the outer surface of a pine log freezes solid, drawing thermal energy out from the inner wood fibers through conductive heat transfer. The wood itself does not store heat. It merely acts as a slow conduit bleeding interior warmth out into the cold sky. Even worse, as green timber seasons, shrinks, and shifts across seasons, the mortar chinking between the logs dries out, cracks, and pulls away from the wood. When 40-mile-per-hour Arctic winds hit a traditional cabin, cold air forces its way through thousands of microscopic fissures in the chinking. This is convective heat loss in action. The warm air inside the cabin, being lighter and less dense, rapidly rises toward the roof gaps, creating a natural vacuum effect near the floor. This vacuum draws freezing exterior air inward, through every drafty seam near the base of the walls. In a standard 16 by 20-foot cabin, this convective cycle forces the family to maintain a roaring, wood-devouring inferno in the hearth 24 hours a day just to offset the cold air continuously rushing inward. Now, picture this. Compare that chaotic, energy-wasting cycle with the physical mechanics operating inside Isaac Brenner's earth shelter. Isaac did not try to stop the winter cold with a thin wooden barrier exposed to the screaming winds. Instead, he encased 3 entire sides of his living space and his roof beneath hundreds of thousands of pounds of compacted living soil. Here is the cold, hard truth about earth insulation. Raw dirt is not technically a high-performance insulator like modern fiberglass or foam. Soil has a modest thermal resistance rating, but what Earth lacks in sheer insulation value, it more than makes up for in raw thermal mass and volumetric heat capacity. At a depth of 6 to 8 feet below the surface of the hillside, soil is completely shielded from atmospheric wind currents and solar radiation shifts. The ground temperature at that depth remains locked at a stable baseline, hovering between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year in the Bitterroot region. When Isaac carved his living quarters 12 feet deep into the rising slope of the mountain, he was essentially placing his family inside a massive, naturally regulated thermal envelope. The outer air temperature during the winter of 1887 plummeted to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, but the raw earthen walls forming the back and sides of Isaac's home were not interfacing with minus 31-degree air. They were interfacing with subsoil that sat at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Isaac's small sandstone hearth only needed to bridge a gap of roughly 12 degrees, raising the interior air from 50 degrees up to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. His neighbors in traditional timber cabins, on the other hand, were forced to bridge an astronomical 65-degree temperature gap between their frozen wooden walls and a livable indoor baseline. Their hearths had to work more than 5 times harder every single minute of the day just to keep their living space habitable. The numbers don't lie. Furthermore, Isaac understood the subtle science of interior thermal batteries. He did not leave his dugout floor as bare, loose dirt, nor did he install elevated wooden floorboards with cold air circulating beneath them. He excavated the interior floor down 18 inches below the doorway and laid a continuous, tightly fitted foundation of dense river cobbles set in coarse sand. That stone floor represented over 6,000 pounds of high-density mineral mass. When Isaac burned a modest fire of dry split pine in his central sandstone fireplace, the radiant heat traveled outward in all directions. The thermal radiation warmed the room's air, but more importantly, it charged the 6,000 pounds of river stone beneath their feet and the 4,000 pounds of sandstone forming the hearth structure. As long as the hearth fire was burning, those 10,000 pounds of stone absorbed thermal energy, raising their core temperature to near 70 degrees Fahrenheit. When the fire eventually died down to gray ash after midnight, those 10,000 pounds of dense stone did not instantly cool down. They began slowly, steadily discharging their stored thermal energy back into the living room through radiant heat transfer. Radiant heat does not warm the air directly. It warms the objects and people in the room. The stone floor radiated warmth upward into the room's furniture, the beds, and the bare feet of the Brenner children, maintaining an even, comfortable living environment long after the last log had burned to coal. Stay with me here, because what happened next regarding moisture control was equally brilliant. One of the biggest hazards of winter homestead survival is interior humidity and moisture accumulation. In a standard drafty log cabin, as family members breathe, cook meals, and boil water, water vapor fills the warm indoor air. When that warm, humid air comes into contact with frozen interior log walls or single-pane glass windows, the moisture instantly condenses, forming thick layers of frost and ice on the inside of the home. Over weeks of continuous cold, that indoor frost builds up, creating a damp, rotting environment that breeds respiratory illness, ruins dry food stores, and causes severe mold growth across clothing and bedding. Most pioneers assumed an earth shelter built underground would be hopelessly damp, dark, and wet, a moldy cave where moisture had no way to escape. Vernon Cale and Samuel Hodge both cited dampness as the primary reason Isaac's family would be forced to abandon the dugout within a few months. Here is what everyone missed about Isaac's ventilation design. Isaac did not seal his dugout like an airtight box. Near the highest point of the rear earthen ceiling, he carved 3 narrow angled ventilation shafts that extended upward through the 12-inch sod roof and exited above the snowline. He lined these small vents with hollowed-out wooden tubes fitted with simple sliding wooden dampers that could be opened or closed by pulling a leather cord inside the room. Isaac took advantage of natural thermodynamics, specifically the stack effect. As the sandstone hearth warmed the living space, the warm air naturally rose toward the timber ceiling. This warm, rising air mass created a gentle, continuous positive pressure zone near the roof rafters. When Isaac cracked the wooden dampers open an inch, the warmer, moisture-laden indoor air was pushed smoothly upward and out through the ceiling vents into the freezing outdoor atmosphere. As that stale, humid air escaped upward, fresh, dry outdoor air was pulled inward through a small, controlled intake vent located near the base of the south-facing timber wall. Because the incoming outdoor air was cold and bone-dry, as soon as it entered the dugout and touched the warm riverstone floor, its relative humidity dropped drastically. The dry air absorbed any surface moisture lingering on the raw earthen walls or living space, carrying it smoothly up and out through the ceiling dampers in a continuous, silent ventilation loop. The interior of Isaac's dugout remained dry, crisp, and completely free of interior frost or condensation throughout the entire 32-day sub-zero freeze. While neighboring log cabins were coated in interior frost and filled with choking wood smoke from struggling chimneys, Isaac's home enjoyed clean, dry, continuously refreshed air, maintained at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. To fully appreciate the severity of the crisis facing the rest of the Bitterroot Valley during that brutal winter of 1887, you have to look at the tragic experience of the Miller family who settled 3 miles south of Isaac's Ridge. Jacob Miller was a hard-working, experienced homesteader who had built a massive, beautifully crafted 2-story log cabin in 1884. It was considered one of the finest homes in Flathead County, featuring hand-hewn fir timber walls, 2 large brick chimneys, and an expansive shake roof. Jacob prided himself on doing things by the book, adhering strictly to traditional Eastern construction techniques. When the Arctic front slammed into the valley on November 14, 1887, Jacob felt completely confident in his home's ability to weather the storm. He had stacked 4 cords of split pine beside his kitchen door, and had another 8 cords stored in a timber woodshed 50 yards from the cabin. By November 20th, 6 days into the freeze, with temperatures holding steady at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, Jacob's confidence began to turn into blind panic. The screaming northern winds created severe air pressure differentials around Jacob's 2-story cabin. The wind struck the northern wall of the home, forcing its way through small cracks in the mortar, chinking that had expanded during the sudden freeze. The icy draft rushed across the ground floor, dropping the floor-level temperature inside the kitchen to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. Jacob and his 2 eldest sons were forced to run both fireplaces at maximum capacity, day and night, shoveling logs into the fireboxes until the iron grates glowed dull red. Because the upper story of the cabin was unheated, the hot air from the ground floor hearths rushed upward toward the roof, escaping through gaps in the wooden shakes. This massive thermal updraft created a powerful suction effect on the ground floor, pulling even more freezing air inward through the timber walls. The cabin was behaving like a giant, inefficient wooden chimney, sucking freezing Arctic air in through the lower walls and blowing expensive heat out through the roof. By December 1st, 16 days into the cold lock, Jacob Miller had burned through his 4-cord wood pile near the kitchen door and half of his main shed reserves. Every 48 hours, Jacob and his sons had to trek through knee-deep snow in minus 30-degree air to haul heavy firewood back to the cabin, a brutal physical effort that consumed thousands of calories and exposed their hands and faces to severe frostbite. On the night of December 5th, disaster struck the Miller cabin. The intense, continuous heat required to maintain the main brick chimney caused a severe thermal stress fracture deep inside the masonry stack. A structural crack opened up behind the living room mantelpiece, filling the ground floor with thick, suffocating pine smoke within minutes. Jacob was forced to damp down the main hearth fire completely to prevent his wooden house from catching fire in the middle of a sub-zero blizzard. With the main fireplace extinguished, the interior temperature of Jacob's 2-story cabin dropped from 50 degrees to 4 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 3 hours. Desperate to keep his wife and 4 young children from freezing to death in their beds, Jacob had to move his entire family into the small kitchen, hanging heavy wool blankets over the doorways and gathering everyone around the iron cookstove. They burned split fence rails, wooden furniture, and green pine logs just to keep the small room above freezing until morning. 2 days later, Jacob abandoned his homestead, loading his shivering family onto an open horse-drawn sled and driving them through 6 miles of frozen snow to the town hotel. The Miller family survived, but their homestead was crippled. Their livestock, left unattended in drafty timber barns, suffered terrible losses, and Jacob spent the remainder of the winter paying high room rates at the hotel, while his dream home sat frozen and abandoned in the snow. Jacob Miller's experience was not an isolated tragedy. It was repeated in varying degrees across dozens of homesteads throughout the territory during the Great Freeze of 1887. And that's when everything changed for the settlers of the Bitterroot Valley. News of Isaac Brenner's incredible success spread not through newspaper articles or official reports, but through the hard, undeniable reality observed by desperate men like Samuel Hodge, Vernon Cale, and Jacob Miller. When Samuel Hodge rode back to the trading post after visiting Isaac's dugout, he did not join the usual men standing around the potbelly stove to complain about the weather or share rumors of lost cattle. He walked straight to the storekeeper's desk, pulled out a stub pencil, and began calculating the cost of hiring an excavation team to dig into his own hillside come spring. The storekeeper looked at Samuel and asked, "What are you planning, Hodge?" Samuel looked up, his face still red from the cold wind, and said flatly, "I am done burning 8 cords of wood a month to freeze in my own living room. Come April, I am digging my family 6 feet into the ground." The storekeeper stared at him in utter astonishment. "You are taking Brenner's side? You called his house a badger hole 4 months ago." Samuel leaned over the counter, looked the storekeeper dead in the eye, and said, "I stood in Isaac Brenner's living room 2 hours ago. His fire was dead out. His outside wall was raw mountain dirt. His girls were playing on the floor without shoes, and my thermometer read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The math does not care about my pride, John. Isaac was right, and the rest of us were fools." Let that sink in for a moment. A community of hardened, independent frontier settlers, men who prided themselves on traditional woodworking skills and Eastern craftsmanship, were forced to admit that their traditional construction methods were completely inadequate for extreme survival. By the middle of December, as word of the dugout's performance reached every corner of the county, the public perception of Isaac Brenner transformed almost overnight. He was no longer viewed as an eccentric crank or a lazy carpenter trying to avoid proper timber work. He was suddenly sought out as the premier survival engineer in the territory. Settlers who had scoffed at his excavation in August now braved -20-degree temperatures to trek up his slope, knocking on his timber door, not to offer unsolicited advice, but to ask for help. Isaac welcomed every single visitor into his warm, dry living room with quiet hospitality. Catherine kept a heavy pot of black coffee resting on the sandstone hearth, offering hot drinks to shivering homesteaders, while Isaac sat at the wooden table, sketching structural blueprints on scrap brown paper. He showed them how to calculate the structural load capacity required for log rafters supporting a 12-inch sod roof. He explained the precise depth required to reach stable subsoil temperatures. He demonstrated how to angle the ventilation shafts to create a natural air draft without letting cold wind whistle into the room. He taught them the physics of the stone thermal battery, explaining why field stones, set in sand floor beds, stored heat 4 times longer than elevated wooden floorboards. When Vernon Cale visited the dugout for his second inspection on December 18th, he brought along a young settler named Thomas Reed, who had lost 2 toes to frostbite while trying to cut green firewood during the cold snap. Vernon stood near the warm sandstone hearth, watching Thomas examine the construction details, and said to Isaac, "You should charge these men for your plans, Brenner. You could make a small fortune selling blueprints for these earth shelters." Isaac shook his head, adjusted the damper on his hearth flue, and replied gently, "The earth does not charge us for its heat, Vernon. Why should I charge my neighbors for learning how to use it? If a man knows how to keep his children from freezing in the winter, he has an obligation to share that knowledge." That simple, unselfish attitude cemented Isaac Brenner's legacy across the territory. When the spring thaw finally cleared the snowdrifts from the valley floor in April of 1888, the Bitterroot Valley experienced an unprecedented building boom, not of grand timber cabins or tall frame houses, but of carefully engineered earth-sheltered homes. Settlers did not simply copy Isaac's dugout. They adapted his core physical principles to fit their specific land topographies, family sizes, and available building materials. Rich homesteaders, with access to heavy equipment, dug massive 20 by 30-foot excavations into south-facing mountain ridges, lining the interior walls with split fieldstone set in lime mortar, and topping the structure with double-layered sod roofs planted with native wild grasses. Poorer homesteaders with limited tools carved modest earth shelters directly into stream banks or small hillocks, using heavy cedar logs for roof rafters and building small stone fireplaces modeled after Isaac's sandstone hearth. Even settlers who refused to move out of their original timber cabins began incorporating earth-sheltering techniques into their existing homes. They shoveled deep dirt mounds against the northern and western timber walls of their cabins, creating protective earth berms 6 feet high to shield their drafty chinking from winter winds. They installed stone masonry floor beds around their fireplaces to act as thermal heat batteries. By the winter of 1888, just 12 months after the Great Freeze, over 24 families across Flathead County were living in full or partial earth-sheltered structures. When another severe cold front swept across Montana in January of 1889, dropping temperatures to -25 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 days, not a single family living in a Brenner-style earth shelter was forced to abandon their home. Fuel consumption across those homesteads dropped by an average of 65%, saving hundreds of cords of standing timber and thousands of hours of backbreaking winter labor. The numbers don't lie. To appreciate why Isaac Brenner's construction methods reshaped survival thinking across the territory, you must examine the precise mechanical engineering required to build a sod-roofed earth shelter capable of withstanding decades of harsh mountain weather. Here is what everyone missed about building a sod roof that will not rot, collapse, or leak under thousands of pounds of wet snow. Most pioneers who attempted to build simple dugouts or sod shelters in the early 19th century failed for one primary reason: water infiltration. A poorly designed earthen roof becomes a soggy, waterlogged nightmare during spring thaws. As snow melts on top of raw soil, liquid water saturates the dirt, doubling its weight, dissolving clay binders, and eventually leaking through ceiling timber seams in muddy streams that ruin interior living quarters and cause heavy roof logs to decay and collapse. Isaac Brenner avoided this catastrophic failure mode through a multi-layered engineered roof assembly that operated as a dynamic water-shedding membrane. First, Isaac selected heavy, aged Douglas fir logs for his roof rafters, choosing trunks that were at least 10 inches in diameter. He peeled the bark off every log manually, using a draw knife. Removing the bark was a critical step that many amateur builders overlooked. Bark traps moisture, fungal spores, and wood-boring beetle larvae directly against the sapwood, accelerating rot beneath the soil layer. By stripping the bark clean and allowing the timber to dry in the summer sun, Isaac created rock-hard, rot-resistant structural beams. He notched these massive rafters tightly over the front timber wall header and anchored them deep into the rear earthen ledge, maintaining a sharp 6-degree downward slope toward the front of the structure. This slope was vital. It ensured that any excess surface moisture would naturally migrate forward under gravity toward a gravel drainage trench rather than pooling in the center of the ceiling. Over these peeled rafters, Isaac laid hand-split pine shakes, overlapping them like roof shingles. But he did not stop there. To create an absolute waterproof barrier between the soil and the timber frame, Isaac used thick canvas sailcloth that he had hauled west from Pennsylvania. He laid the canvas flat over the wooden shakes and treated the material with a boiling compound of pine tar, beeswax, and rendered tallow. Think about that for a second. This boiled pine tar coating penetrated deep into the canvas fibers, creating a flexible, completely hydrophobic membrane that could flex under extreme weight shifts without cracking or tearing. Water could not penetrate it, roots could not pierce it, and wood decay fungi could not survive beneath its chemical barrier. Over this sealed, waterproof canvas, Isaac applied his dirt layer, but he did not simply shovel loose topsoil onto the roof. He traveled 2 miles down to the river basin, where dense, fibrous sod grew thick along the marshy banks. Using a flat spade, Isaac cut individual sod bricks 3 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and 18 inches long. These sod bricks were held together by a dense, interlocking matrix of living grass roots. Isaac laid these sod bricks directly over the canvas in a double-layered, staggered brick pattern, with the living grass side facing upward on the top course. As spring arrived, the living grass roots continued to grow, weaving the individual sod bricks together into a single, continuous, living mat of turf spanning the entire 16 by 20-foot roof. This living root matrix served a brilliant dual purpose. During heavy summer rainstorms, the living grass absorbed surface moisture, using the water to grow thicker and denser. During winter blizzards, the 12-inch layer of dead grass and compacted soil provided an insulative air-trapping cushion that prevented indoor heat from rising into the snowpack above. Because the interior heat was retained inside the room by the pine tar membrane, the snow resting on top of the sod roof did not melt from beneath. In a traditional log cabin with an uninsulated shake roof, heat constantly escapes through the wooden ceiling, melting the bottom layer of snow resting on the roof shingles. This melted water runs down toward the cold roof eaves, where it freezes into massive ice dams that back up under the shingles, causing severe leaks and structural damage. On Isaac's sod roof, the snow layer remained completely frozen from top to bottom, acting as an additional, free, 8-inch blanket of insulative snow throughout the winter months. Now, picture this. Consider how this living earth shelter performed when the seasons flipped and the ferocious summer heat hit the Bitterroot Valley in July of 1888. In the high mountain valleys of Montana, summer weather can be as extreme as winter freezing. Outdoor air temperatures in July and August regularly climb to 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, baking traditional single-story timber cabins until their interiors feel like wooden ovens. In Jacob Miller's rebuilt cabin, summer heat turned the uninsulated upper floor into a stifling, unlivable hotbox. The thin wooden walls absorbed solar radiation all day long, radiating heat inward long after the sun set behind the mountains. Inside Isaac Brenner's earth shelter, however, thermodynamics worked in exact reverse. While the outdoor air soared to 95 degrees in the afternoon sun, the interior of Isaac's dugout remained at a cool, crisp, dry 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The hundreds of thousands of pounds of living soil surrounding the back and sides of the dugout acted as a massive cold sink. The summer heat striking the hillside could not penetrate 12 feet of dense earth during the short daylight hours. By the time the summer heat wave began to warm the outer topsoil in late August, autumn had arrived, cooling the ground back down. The earth surrounding Isaac's home operated on a 6-month thermal delay cycle. The cold winter air of January cooled the subterranean soil 6 feet deep, and that stored coolness kept the dugout cold throughout June and July. Conversely, the baking heat of August warmed the upper earth layers, and that stored summer thermal energy slowly migrated downward, reaching the living space in late November just as the winter cold front arrived. Let that sink in. Isaac Brenner was living in a home that naturally harvested winter cold to cool his family in the summer, and harvested summer heat to warm his family in the winter. He accomplished this without a single mechanical pump, electrical circuit, or complex valve system. He did it purely by understanding the physical mass of the planet beneath his feet. Stay with me here, because the benefits of this year-round thermal stability extended far beyond personal comfort. It fundamentally altered the family's ability to preserve food and build long-term homestead wealth. In traditional pioneer homesteading, preserving fresh meat, dairy products, and autumn root crops was a constant losing battle against seasonal temperature swings. During summer months, milk turned sour in hours, butter melted, and fresh meat spoiled within a day unless salted heavily or smoked until tough as leather. During severe winter freezes, stored potatoes, apples, and squash kept in standard wooden pantries froze solid, bursting their cell walls and turning into inedible mush as soon as they thawed. Because Isaac's earth shelter maintained a strict, stable indoor temperature envelope between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, Catherine Brenner possessed the most reliable food storage facility in Flathead County. She could store fresh milk and cream on the stone floor near the back earthen wall for days without spoilage. Root vegetables stored in wooden crates along the rear wall remained crisp, firm, and completely free of frost damage from October all the way through May. While neighboring families lost up to 40% of their winter food reserves to mold, rot, or freezing, the Brenner family preserved every single bushel of potatoes, apples, and carrots harvested from their summer garden. This exceptional food security allowed Isaac to spend less time hunting or buying expensive commercial supplies at the trading post, freeing up his time to clear fertile agricultural acreage and expand his livestock operations. By the autumn of 1889, 2 years after the Great Freeze, Isaac's homestead was generating a surplus of high-value dairy products and winter vegetables that he sold to town residents at premium prices. His decision to build an earth shelter had not only saved his family from freezing, it had accelerated their financial independence by decades. And that's when neighboring homesteaders began realizing that earth-sheltered architecture was not just a temporary survival hack for desperate winters, but a superior long-term strategy for building wealth on the frontier. Consider the case of Samuel Hodge, the timber merchant who had originally mocked Isaac's dugout as a badger hole. When Samuel completed his own 16 by 18-foot earth-sheltered home in the spring of 1888, he kept detailed financial records of his operational costs compared to his old timber cabin. In his previous log home, Samuel spent 40 days every autumn cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking 12 cords of hardwood to prepare for winter heating. That represented 40 days of hard labor that could have been spent clearing timberland for profitable agricultural crops or managing his lumber yard. In his new earth shelter, Samuel burned just 2.5 cords of wood over the entire winter season, requiring less than 8 days of wood preparation labor. Samuel freed up over 30 days of prime labor every single year. He used that reclaimed time to build a specialized stone springhouse and clear 10 additional acres of fertile bottomland, planting grain crops that yielded a significant cash profit the following harvest season. Samuel wrote a detailed letter to his brother back in Ohio in 1890, summarizing his experience with earth-sheltered living. "Here is the cold, hard truth," Samuel wrote. "We spent years back east thinking that a man's success was measured by how high his wooden house stood above the grass. But out here in mountain country, height is just exposure to wind and cold." Isaac Brenner showed us that true strength lies in building down into the stone and soil. "My family stays warmer on half a cord of wood than we ever did burning 10 cords in our old log house, and my children have not had a single lung cough since we moved into the hill." Samuel's letter was published in an Ohio agricultural newspaper in 1891, sparking widespread interest in earth-sheltered construction across the Midwest and Plains states. Farmers across western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, and the Dakotas regions, where standing timber was practically non-existent and winter blizzards were notoriously lethal, began studying the Brenner dugout model. They adapted the design to the flat prairie landscape by constructing semi-submerged sod houses featuring thick earthen walls and heavy turf roofs. While prairie soddies had existed in crude forms before, the specific engineering refinements pioneered by Isaac Brenner, such as the stone floor thermal battery, the pine tar waterproof membrane, the angled draft chimney, and the roof-level moisture dampers turned crude prairie dugouts into permanent, comfortable, highly efficient homes. The numbers don't lie. By the turn of the century, in 1900, thousands of families across the American West were living comfortably in earth-sheltered structures built using the exact physical principles Isaac Brenner had applied in the Bitterroot Valley in 1887. Now, picture this. Think about how these historical engineering principles apply to our modern world today. We live in an era dominated by complex, energy-intensive technology. Modern residential homes rely almost entirely on continuous grid electricity, natural gas pipelines, digital thermostats, and complex mechanical heating and cooling systems to maintain a comfortable indoor living environment. We build thin-walled homes above ground, seal them with synthetic plastic wraps, install massive glass windows, and attempt to maintain comfort by blasting forced hot air or air conditioning 24 hours a day. When the modern power grid fails during a severe winter storm or an extreme summer heat wave, these modern homes lose their internal temperatures within hours. Water pipes burst inside thin walls, interiors plunge toward freezing, and families are left completely vulnerable to the elements, despite living in structures that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct. We have built a society that relies on brute technological force to fight nature, rather than smart design that works in harmony with physical laws. The lesson buried in that Montana hillside is as relevant today as it was in 1887. When you design a shelter that respects thermal mass, leverages ground temperature baselines, eliminates unwanted wind infiltration, and uses the natural energy storage capacity of stone and earth, you create a home that is naturally resilient. You create a shelter that protects human life automatically, without requiring complex mechanical systems or endless fuel consumption. Isaac Brenner did not rely on modern technology or expensive imported materials. He built his shelter using a pickaxe, a shovel, local field stones, raw soil, and a clear understanding of basic thermodynamics. He showed that real engineering is not about how complex you can make a system, it is about how simple, efficient, and self-sustaining you can make it when survival is on the line. Stay with me here, because what happened to the Brenner family in the early 20th century shows just how durable and adaptable these structures truly were over long periods. In 1902, after living in the dugout for 15 continuous years, Isaac Brenner decided to build a large, formal, two-story wood frame house lower down the slope. His daughters, Emily and Ruth, were grown young women, and Catherine wanted a grand dining room to host church gatherings and community dinners. Many homesteaders who eventually built modern frame houses completely demolished their old pioneer shelters, viewing them as embarrassing relics of a poorer, harder past. Isaac refused to touch a single stone of his dugout. He recognized that the earth shelter possessed functional capabilities that his new, modern, two-story frame house could never match. While the Brenner family slept and ate in their new wooden house, they kept the dugout fully operational. They converted the front living room into a permanent food preservation and dairy management facility, storing hundreds of jars of canned fruit, smoked meats, and crocks of butter on the stone floor. During the summer months of July and August, when the upper floor of their new wooden house became hot and uncomfortable, Catherine and the girls would move their sewing and mending work up to the cool, 65-degree dugout. During severe winter storms, when high mountain winds rattled the glass windows of their two-story frame home, Isaac would check the small sandstone hearth in the dugout, lighting a low wood fire to ensure their stored food reserves remained completely protected from freezing. In November of 1911, 24 years after the Great Freeze of 1887, a sudden, historic Arctic storm known as the Great Blue Norther swept across the central United States and the Rocky Mountain region. In a single 12-hour period on November 11, 1911, outdoor temperatures across Montana plunged by over 60 degrees Fahrenheit, catching thousands of residents completely unprepared. High winds damaged power lines and shattered windows in the newly developed towns across the valley. The furnace inside Isaac Brenner's two-story frame house suffered a mechanical flue failure, filling the new home with choking gas and forcing the family to evacuate outdoors into -10-degree air in the middle of the night. Isaac did not hesitate. He led Catherine, his daughters, and 2 visiting grandchildren up the dark mountain slope to the old 19-year-old dugout. He opened the heavy timber door, stepped across the threshold, and lit a small fire in the central sandstone hearth. Within 30 minutes, the stone floor was warm. The dry air was sitting at a stable 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Brenner family spent the night sleeping comfortably on wool cots while the Arctic blizzard raged outside. The 30-year-old earth shelter had saved the Brenner family for a second time, proving once again that simple, passive physical engineering will outlast and outperform complex mechanical systems when extreme emergency strikes. The numbers don't lie. When you examine the full sweep of American frontier history, the story of Isaac Brenner's dugout stands as a masterclass in quiet, unpretentious engineering. Isaac was not a trained scientist with a degree from a university back east. He was not a wealthy speculator with unlimited capital to buy expensive building supplies. He was simply a thoughtful carpenter who refused to let social pressure or tradition overrule the plain evidence of physical laws. Here is what everyone missed about the evolution of frontier architecture. Progress is not always a straight line moving forward toward lighter, thinner, more modern-looking materials. When early settlers moved westward across the North American continent, they brought Eastern building assumptions with them. In the humid, heavily forested regions of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ohio, timber was abundant. Winters were relatively short, and building elevated wooden houses made practical sense. Timber framing was viewed as the hallmark of civilization, while earth-sheltered structures were associated with crude, temporary shelters used by trappers or miners who intended to abandon the land after a single season. This cultural prejudice against building into the ground was so deeply ingrained that frontiersmen routinely chose to freeze inside prestigious-looking log cabins rather than live comfortably inside a mocked dirt dugout. They prioritized the outward appearance of civilization over the physical reality of survival. Isaac Brenner possessed the intellectual courage to strip away that cultural bias. When he saw his 4-year-old daughter coughing in their drafty cabin during the winter of 1885, he did not ask himself what a respectable home was supposed to look like. He asked himself a much simpler, far more urgent question: what structural form will keep my children warm on the minimum amount of fuel? The answer to that question was resting right beneath his feet on the south-facing mountain slope. Now, picture this. Consider how Isaac's design principles continued to influence construction throughout the Bitterroot Valley for over half a century. Long after Isaac's original dugout had transitioned into a food storage facility, local builders continued to incorporate his thermal mass strategies into modern homes, schools, and civic buildings across Flathead County. When the town built its first permanent masonry schoolhouse in 1908, the head contractor did not build a thin, drafty wooden structure. He excavated the foundation 6 feet into the north-facing hillside, lined the lower walls with 3 feet of native sandstone, and installed deep earth berms along the northern exterior wall to shield the classrooms from winter winds. The schoolhouse remained warm and comfortable throughout the winter months, consuming less than half the heating fuel required by neighboring town halls. When local dairy farmers constructed large milking barns in the 1920s, they built them directly into south-facing hillsides, creating earth-banked structures that kept dairy herds warm during winter freezes and cool during summer heat waves, without expensive mechanical systems. Isaac Brenner's willingness to challenge convention in 1887 had permanently altered how an entire region thought about thermal insulation, land topography, and fuel conservation. The numbers don't lie. Between 1887 and 1930, documented wood fuel savings across Flathead County homesteads that adopted earth-sheltering principles amounted to tens of thousands of cords of timber. That represented millions of hours of saved human labor, reduced deforestation across local watersheds, and provided an unmatched level of winter security for generations of homesteading families. Think about that for a second. A single, quiet carpenter, working alone with a pickaxe and shovel on an abandoned-looking slope, saved his entire community. Millions of hours of backbreaking labor simply by proving that Earth holds heat. By 1930, 43 years after Isaac first carved his living space into the hillside, the original dugout was finally allowed to rest. Isaac Brenner passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1928, at the age of 75. His beloved wife, Catherine, had passed 2 years earlier. Their daughters, Emily and Ruth, had married local farmers and raised children of their own in comfortable, earth-bermed homes across the valley. In 1930, during the early months of the Great Depression, the old homestead property was sold to a timber company, and the original dugout was left untended. Without seasonal maintenance to clear drainage ditches, winter rains slowly washed topsoil down the slope, settling around the heavy timber doorway. Yet, despite 20 years of complete neglect, the structural roof rafters, those peeled Douglas fir logs, treated with pine tar and sealed beneath canvas, refused to cave in. The heavy sod roof, woven together by 40 years of living grass roots, stood firm against mountain blizzards, summer downpours, and spring thaws. It was not until 1950, 63 years after Isaac laid the first stone, that a massive mudslide triggered by an unseasonal torrential rainstorm swept down the upper ridge, burying the entrance under several feet of wet mountain soil. The earth gently reclaimed what it had provided 6 decades earlier. Today, if you visit that eastern slope in Flathead County, you will not find a historical marker or a bronze plaque bearing Isaac Brenner's name. There are no gift shops, guided tours, or paved parking lots. To the untrained eye of a modern highway driver passing through the valley, the slope looks completely unremarkable, just another green mountain hill covered in wild grass, mountain wildflowers, and stands of ponderosa pine. But if you climb that slope on a crisp autumn afternoon, leave the beaten trail behind, and look closely at the natural contours of the hill, you can still discover the quiet physical evidence of Isaac's labor. You will find a subtle, rectangular indentation cut 6 feet deep into the rising slope. Near the base of that depression, half buried beneath decades of fallen pine needles and rich black soil, sit the smooth, flat river stones Isaac hauled up from the creek bed in the summer of 1887. If you brush away the pine needles and press your bare palm against those stones on a cold October morning, you will feel something remarkable. The stones are not freezing cold. They are firm, dry, and cool, resting at that exact same stable baseline temperature, 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, that kept 2 small girls barefoot and laughing while an Arctic blizzard raged outside 63 years ago. The stone thermal battery is still sitting there in the soil, completely ready to hold and radiate heat if a fire were lit upon it today. Stay with me here, because what Isaac Brenner accomplished on that Montana hillside holds a profound lesson for anyone seeking true self-reliance in our modern world. We live in a modern culture that frequently equates technological complexity with safety. We are conditioned to believe that the newest, most complex, most expensive solution is automatically the best solution. We rely on fragile, interconnected systems that we do not own, do not understand, and cannot repair when they break down. We assume that because a building technique or a survival method is old, it must be primitive, outdated, and inferior to modern methods. Here is the cold, hard truth. Physics does not care about modern fashion, building trends, or technological arrogance. The laws of thermodynamics operate today with the exact same unyielding precision that they did in 1887. Earth holds heat. Stone acts as a thermal battery. Wind infiltration strips warmth faster than fire can produce it. Living soil provides unmatched insulation. These are fundamental truths of nature. They were true for indigenous Earth Lodge builders 500 years ago. They were true for Isaac Brenner during the Great Freeze of 1887, and they remain completely true for us today. True survival wisdom is not about accumulating complex tactical gadgets or relying on expensive grid infrastructure. It is about understanding how the physical world actually works, stripping away pride and cultural bias, and having the practical wisdom to recognize that old methods are not obsolete methods. It is about listening to the land, observing what actually works when human lives are on the line, and building solutions that stand firm when the modern systems fail around us. Isaac Brenner did not seek fame, wealth, or approval from his neighbors. He simply wanted to keep his family warm through a mountain winter. In doing so, he proved that when human ingenuity aligns itself with the laws of nature, a simple hole in the dirt can outshine the grandest timber cabin, and a quiet man with a shovel can teach an entire valley how to survive. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from today. And tell me, if you were forced to build an emergency shelter tomorrow to withstand a severe winter power outage, would you choose a traditional above-ground structure? Or would you dig into the earth like Isaac Brenner did? What forgotten architectural technique from history do you think modern homebuilders should start using again today? If you found value in this story, if you learned a real physical principle that might matter when the power grid goes down, or winter weather turns lethal, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Every single week, I bring you one real, documented engineering technique from history that worked when lives depended on it. No fluff, no untested theories, just proven physical knowledge that stood the test of the hardest conditions humans have ever faced. This is practical survival wisdom, and it is worth preserving. This presentation features a dramatized historical reconstruction based on documented earth-sheltered construction methodologies utilized in the Montana Territory during the late 19th century. While specific narrative character arcs and personal dialogue are dramatized for narrative engagement, all technical principles, including ground temperature baselines, thermal mass capacities, sod roof waterproofing layers, and fuel consumption comparisons, reflect verified thermodynamic physics and documented frontier practices. Modern applications of earth-sheltered construction should always consult current building codes, structural engineering standards, and professional safety guidelines.